This should be excellent. Okay, cool. That should be started. Um, so, sorry, bear with me 1 second. So just to, oh, actually, sorry, 1 second. Should be back here. So just to quickly go over the agenda. We will have a few minutes for some introductions from myself and Jenny, and then we'll have a quick poll to see kind of who we have attending today, where people are calling in from. We will then spend around half an hour going over the PLOS Academic Editor role, talking about kind of what the role involves, the review process, and so on. Then we'll have around 10 minutes for the Q&A portion of the session and a few minutes just for some kind of closing statements. And then finally, there will be an opportunity for all of you to meet with each other as members of the board, should you wish to do so at the end. Okay, great. So, introductions. I'm Marcus. I'm one of the editorial research associates on the editorial board services team. Our team is responsible for a kind of fairly broad range of duties within PLOS. We work with editorial board management, board member experience, and editorial board recruitment. I've been at PLOS for just over a year and a half now. Before this, I was working at Frontiers in a similar role, and this was after completing my master's degree in marine science. Okay, Jenny, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Marcus. I am one of the staff editors here at PLOS, so I'm specifically based in the medicine team in PLOS 1, but we help out across sort of journals as well. So I do see work from the other journals. I have a background in molecular neuroscience, so my PhD was in Parkinson's research. And similarly to Marcus, before joining PLOS 2.5 years ago, I was also at Frontiers. So kind of, I've got almost 5 years in publishing experience now, which is great. And it's been great to develop in this role at PLOS. And as Marcus said, we're really pleased to have you on the editorial board and to have you here today to talk a bit more about the role and to help answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So there is now, assuming this works and Zoom is going to play ball today, there is a poll that should hopefully be going out to all of you now. Okay, great. These are just some kind of general get to know you questions, talking about what journal you're going to be on the editorial board for, how long you've been an active researcher, if there are any other editorial boards that you serve on, and also whereabouts you're calling in from as well. So I will leave that open for a minute or so, just to see if we can get some responses and see where people are based. And there's also a fun question there about whether you prefer cats or dogs. Okay, great. We will call it there. Okay, so seems like we've got a fairly good spread of people from different journals, primarily PLOS One, which is not super surprising. It's our largest journal, so that makes sense. But we also have a few people from Global Public Health and from Climate and Water. Um, Fairly mixed results for cats and dogs, or people who aren't too fond of either. I'm also noticing that the where in the world you are calling in from today option, I'm hoping is going to be visible once I click end, because these are short answer ones. In fact, hopefully you should all be able to see these in here. Okay, great. So I will stop sharing the poll. Okay, so back to the main portion of the slides. So hopefully you should all be able to see the next slide here. Actually, 1 second, Jenny. Is that visible, the editorial board slide? Or is it still in the introductions one? Okay,
Yeah,
brilliant.
it's visible now.
Okay, great. So yes, editorial boards. So these tend to be larger than the subject-specific or society journals. And again, this is to kind of cover the broad scope, particularly for PLOS One, and also the high volume of submissions that our journals receive. There are two editorial roles across these journals. First of all, we have section editors. So these editors will advise on kind of subject-specific issues and manuscripts, and they'll also participate in a kind of deeper level in section engagement as well. And then we have academic editors, which is all of you. So you will oversee the peer review process and are responsible to a very large degree in determining what we should publish or not. Recruitment for this role occurs through kind of a range of channels, including application, subject-specific invitations, or referrals. And you can also see your fellow editorial board members by visiting the pages linked here. And you can search by individual, country, section, classification. So I'll just demonstrate this quickly. Hopefully this should all be visible to everyone still. So if we use PLOS One as an example, just double check again, Jenny, this is definitely visible on the screen.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so again, if you were looking at the editorial board for PLOS One, for example, if you wanted to find other people on the board who were in your particular area of research, so this was biogeochemistry, for example. You could search for the classification biogeochemistry, and you should see that we have currently 64 editors on PLOS One editorial board who have expertise in that particular area. So if you're ever curious about who else is on the board in your area of expertise, you can search them on here, and this applies to all of our other PLOS journals as well. Okay, so back to here. Hopefully this should be visible. Okay, great. So, moving on to the academic editor role itself. So, in short, academic editors oversee the peer review process from beginning to end. You will have seen this already during your recruitment and onboarding process, but just to kind of briefly recap what this involves. This is conducting an initial assessment based on the PLOS publication criteria, finding and inviting reviewers for the manuscript, evaluating their feedback, making editorial decisions on those papers, and then communicating those decisions to the authors. And of course, as part of this, academic editors play a very active role in the community. They are, highly engaged as representatives of PLOS. Moving on to the code of conduct. We obviously take publication and research ethics very seriously here at PLOS, and we expect our editorial board members to do the same. You can find this code at the PLOS Editor Center, which is linked here at the top of the slide. And this would have also been shared with you as part of the recruitment and onboarding process. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at this in more depth, we would strongly recommend that you do so, just in order to be aware of our guidelines and our stance on things like this. So, if anyone has not had the chance, again, I would strongly recommend going through that in some depth. Okay, so moving on to Editorial Manager. So Editorial Manager is the submission system that we use. This is provided by a company called Aries. When you are starting out as an academic editor, the first things that you want to do are update the My Information page. So this includes verifying your contact information and your institution. Also indicating your areas of expertise, so adding relevant classifications and keywords that represent you and your field of research. And then lastly, being aware of how to set unavailable dates. So for when you're traveling out of office for work or health related reasons, or essentially unavailable for any reason for any period of time. And there is a screenshot guide linked here in the slide, which I'll just go through quickly now. So under the kind of getting started point here, this would explain how to do the above steps that I've just described. And I also want to very quickly emphasize one of the steps that I've mentioned, and that is adding classification terms to your profile that accurately represent your expertise. And again, this is covered in this section here. The reason for this is because these are one of the indicators that are used when invitations are sent out to handle manuscripts. And so the more accurate these are, the more likely you are to receive invitations to handle papers that are relevant to you and to your field of research. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this works in a moment. But before that, I'll just talk quickly about the life of a manuscript. So essentially the process that a manuscript will go through from kind of submission to completion. So once an author has submitted the manuscript, the first stage is a technical check. So this is where we will look for things such as formatting, image visibility, metadata, things like that. Then the manuscript will undergo submission scanning, or what we refer to as subscan, where one of our staff editors will check for, amongst other things, the scope of the paper, whether the paper meets our basic publication criteria, any concerns surrounding things like publication ethics. And at this point, should the paper fail to meet these criteria, our staff editors may choose to just reject the paper here. So this would be before the paper would be sent out to any of you as academic editors. Once these two steps have taken place, and assuming that the paper has passed the initial technical check and subscan, this is when the paper is then sent out to you. At this stage, once an academic editor has agreed to handle the manuscript, they may choose to reject the paper without review if they feel that the paper doesn't meet our publication criteria, or would need very substantial revisions in order to do so. Or they can choose to send the paper out for peer review. So they would send out invitations to external reviewers with relevant expertise in that area of research. The reviewers would provide their comments and their recommendations to the manuscript, and then the academic editor would make a decision for that manuscript based on the recommendations from the reviewers and their own assessment of the manuscript. If a revised decision is issued, the paper is then sent back to the authors with the reviewers and editors' comments for improvement. The authors will then resubmit the revised manuscript, and the process will carry on until a final recommendation of either accept or reject is made by the editor. If the paper has been accepted, it then undergoes a final technical check before proceeding through production and eventually publication. Hopefully, that gives kind of a reasonable overview of how the process works. But Jenny will be talking a bit more detail about your role in this in a moment as well. So moving on to invitations. So invitations to handle manuscripts will come to you via email. And again, there is a quick guide here that explains kind of what these look like and kind of how to go about accepting these. So just to start with, kind of what these emails look like. Um, this is kind of an example of the anatomy of these emails, if you will. The kind of layout, the key information, and also how to accept or decline the invitation. Most invitations are going to either be sent by an algorithm known as PLOS Match. So this applies for those of you on PLOS One and PLOS Global Public Health, or using classification matches. So this is for those of you on PLOS Climate, PLOS Mental Health, or PLOS Water. PLOS staff will also send invitations occasionally if the initial round's unsuccessful. So if the paper requires any special handling, also papers that have been reassigned or have been resubmitted. And I will also stress that you always have the choice to accept or decline invitations. And again, in the quick guide beneath the matching section, there is a table here to kind of assist in deciding whether to accept or decline an invitation. And so ideally, you should only accept an invitation if you have the time available to handle the manuscript all the way to a final decision, if it is in your area of expertise, and if you do not have any competing interests with the authors. In addition to this as well, if the paper is in your field of expertise and you have the time to handle it, but you find that the paper isn't suitable for peer review, we would ask that you accept the invitation to handle this and then issue a reject decision, citing the appropriate publication criteria for the relevant journal. Another thing I do want to quickly touch on in regards to invitations that I mentioned a moment ago is that these two initial routes by which invitations are sent out. So again, these are either by an algorithm known as PLOS Match, and again, this is for those of you on PLOS One or Global Public Health, or this is via classification-based matching for climate, mental health, and water. So PLOS Match uses the text of your authored papers, the content in your editorial manager profile, and over time, any published papers that you've handled for PLOS, all in order to create what's known as a similarity score with a particular manuscript. And then PLOS Match will essentially assemble a queue of editors based on those similarity scores. On the other journals, invitations are sent out based on the classification terms that you've listed in your editorial manager profile. And so again, I do want to stress that making sure these are accurate and up to date will improve that experience both for yourself and for authors. So please do fill these out when you get the chance if you haven't done so already. Essentially, to kind of summarize this, the initial rounds of invitations are semi-automated, and realistically, you can expect to receive some invitations that will be outside your area of expertise. Hopefully, these will be minimal, but please do decline these, and there should be an option to indicate that the manuscript is outside of your area of expertise as well. If you do find that you are frequently receiving a lot of invitations to manuscripts that are very clearly outside of your area of expertise, please do get in touch with us. There's several emails listed on the last slide that we have here, one of which is the EdBoard support email address. So that comes directly to the editorial board services team. If you find having any issues like that, please get in touch with us and we will do our best to kind of rectify that as well. Okay, so this is the final slide from me before I hand over to Jenny. And this is just to briefly kind of go through the general kind of peer review timeline. Obviously, this is an idealized version, and we recognize that the timeline and the standards for different subject areas may be very different. And of course, every manuscript is unique, and so may have points to address that are different to others and can, result in varying timelines. But kind of in summary, once you have agreed to handle a manuscript, you would ideally provide an initial valuation in around 3 days. You would then spend a couple of weeks identifying and securing reviewers for the manuscript. Once reviewers have agreed to provide their comments, the manuscript will then sit with them for, say, 2 to 3 weeks. And once all reviewer comments and recommendations have been obtained, you would then ideally provide a decision within 3 days. And if you recommend the paper be revised, the paper is then sent back to the authors with yours and the reviewers' comments and will be resubmitted back to you for the process to repeat until, again, either an accept or reject recommendation is reached. Okay, great. So I will now stop sharing. Jenny, I believe you should be able to start sharing your screen now.
Great. I will. And you see my slides okay?
Yes. Good.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Marcus. So, as Marcus said, we know that the timelines might differ every time you're, obviously handling a manuscript. But we're just kind of going to run through the ideal workflows and then what you kind of need to be aware of and considering at each of these steps. So, when you accept to handle a manuscript as the academic editor, the initial evaluation is a really important part of this step, because it's your opportunity to decide whether this paper should be sent out for peer review or not. In some cases, you might find that a manuscript that's passed all of the submission checks that we do before it's sent out to academic editors has problems, which mean, or kind of methodological concerns or other scientific limitations that mean you do not feel that it's suitable for peer review. And as the academic editor, you do not have to send it to reviewers before issuing a reject decision. You can issue a reject decision as part of the outcome of the initial evaluation if you feel that something is not suitable to send out to reviewers. So in this initial evaluation, you are requested to assess the manuscript against PLOS publication criteria, against any information that staff editors might have called attention to. So when you accept to handle a manuscript as academic editor, the confirmation letter that you get sometimes has some additional notes in it, and these are notes that we add following on from the submission checks that we do, which call attention to particular aspects of the study or might highlight particular considerations that we'd like you to bear in mind when you're handling the manuscript. This could be that we feel it's something potentially controversial or something that might attract media attention. So there are additional considerations for that peer review of that manuscript. It may be that it's a particular type of study. We see observational studies, we see studies using large health databases, and in some instances, there's additional guidance that we recommend kind of adhering to. And also, obviously, applying your own subject area expertise. You are the experts in your research area. You have that foundation of knowledge to recognize whether something is suitable to be sent out for peer review, whether there are concerns in the study design, or there are flaws in the study, or there's sometimes there may be circumstances where it's a great start, but you feel that there's additional work that needs to be done to support the conclusions the authors are making. And all of that can be shared with the authors in this initial decision if you feel that it's not suitable for peer review. So the outcome of this is obviously that you decide whether to send it out for peer review or you reject it without review. There are some additional guidance that you might want to look at. And so this initial evaluation guide helps to provide a little bit of guidance in terms of, summarizing our publication criteria, which are the same across PLOS One, climate, global public health, mental health, and water. Um, you'll notice that novelty is not one of these criteria. However, we do consider redundancy in submissions. So if you feel like, although the work itself has not been published elsewhere, it's redundant or derivative of previous work without providing specific context of why it's necessary and what it's adding to the field, you could reject under that criteria without review. There is information here as well, kind of about that information for academic editors that might come through, and a little bit of guide to help you decide whether to send it out for review or reject. So in general, if there are serious methodological or analytical flaws that cannot be addressed by peer review, you might decide to reject without review. If you feel the conclusions are not supported by the data, so they're overstated, or again, there are flaws in the underlying scientific work, you might choose to reject. If the work is redundant without clearly referencing and discussing the existing literature, or if there are really apparent revisions that would take more than a few months to complete, this might be a circumstance where you would reject giving recommendations for the additional work or reframing that you feel is necessary. And we can call this an open reject, where there's an invitation for the authors to resubmit in the future once they've made these extensive revisions. If these criteria are not met, then we'd encourage you to invite peer reviewers. And please, do not reject because you cannot get a reviewer. And we'll get into that a little bit later. There are some FAQs down here as well. So one of the things that comes up sometimes is around the language, because publication criteria 5 discusses needing the paper to be in sufficient English, but we recognise that we are an international journal and that English is not the first language of many of our authors. So if language is poor, then the authors might be able to revise this. If the language is insufficient for you to be able to understand the paper to conduct that initial assessment, then that's where you might feel that it's necessary to reject on that criteria so that the authors can seek that copy editing assistance and resubmit. But if you're ever unsure, you can reach out to the Journal Office about this and we are able to advise. We don't provide copy editing services for the authors, although we do have some partners that are able to provide discounted services to the authors. And in some cases, you might see a manuscript that doesn't have any results. So we do publish study protocols, which might include pilot results, but it's not a requirement. So please double check the article type if it looks like the results section is missing, because it may be that this is a study protocol in which results are not strictly required. Finding and securing reviewers is then the next step, of course, if you decide to send this out for peer review. And I think this is the most challenging step for a lot of our academic editors. It's not unique to PLOS, unfortunately. And I'm sure that if you collaborate with other journals as an academic editor, you'll have experience of this across the industry as well. The main aim is, of course, to find suitable reviewers that have expertise in subject matter and methodology, are actively working and publishing in the field, and that are unbiased. We know that securing reviewers can be really challenging, and we've identified some tips and strategies that might be able to help. And all reviewer invitations should be managed through editorial manager. So we would request that you're not reaching out kind of externally to editorial manager to invite reviewers, because we want to ensure that the entire peer review history, including all of the invitations, can be seen within this system. Again, we have a quick guide available to help you with this, and we are available if you want to reach out by email if something you're really struggling with, and we're able to advise. All manuscripts must have at least one external reviewer beside yourself as academic editor to be considered for publication in PLOS journals. Occasionally, we'll see instances where it's really challenging to get an external reviewer, but as long as you have one, you can also provide reviewer comments yourself as the academic editor, so that there are two in kind of totality. There is some information in this guide for you around suitable reviewers, what we consider kind of appropriate qualifications and expertise, and how to avoid competing interests and ensure you get an unbiased perspective. So, of course, we want to avoid inviting reviewers with competing interests unless it's absolutely necessary. We want to try and make sure that there's diversity in our reviewers, so not inviting reviewers who are all from one institution, not inviting reviewers that publish work that directly contests the work you're considering, for example, um, while also making sure that there are no perceived conflicts of interest that might be concerning to readers if this is published. So we generally request that you avoid inviting reviewers that work at the same institution as any of the authors. Of course, please avoid inviting reviewers that are listed in the opposed reviewers section of the submission data. We recommend against inviting reviewers that have collaborated or published with the authors during the last 5 years. And this is something you might want to consider when you're considering academic editor invitations. If you have co-authored with the authors of the submission within 5 years, we would request that you recuse yourself and do not accept those invitations because there is this potential perception of biased handling by the readership. And generally, we'd ask that, yeah, you're not inviting reviewers all located at the same institution. Generally speaking, there are kind of three major tips and stages for securing reviewers for submissions. Researchers you know working in your area are more likely to accept invitations because they know you. Um, they are familiar with your work, you're familiar with their work, and therefore you have that ability to determine if they might be suitable and have the relevant expertise to handle the paper. Um, but of course, be mindful of competing interests and avoid always inviting the same individuals because that can be challenging for you, and also challenging for them if they're always receiving invitations to handle papers. Researchers whose work you know, so researchers who you know from the literature, from conferences, from your wider field. You might not know them personally, but you know their experiences on topic for the manuscript, and you have that understanding of their expertise. You can also conduct a broader search if the first two strategies are not suitable for manuscript you're handling or fail to secure reviewers. So there's the Web of Science reviewer locator tool that can provide a list of suggested reviewers, but they should be kind of checked against the checklist above. You can also use databases such as PubMed, Google Scholar, and Web of Science to find articles similar to the one you're working on and consider inviting the corresponding or last authors. You might also find some suitable reviewers in the reference list of the article. Just again, be mindful of that competing interest. There are additional tips here, and one of the great things about Editorial Manager is that you can set up alternate reviewers. So you can send a batch of invitations and then set an alternate batch, which means that without you having to relog into Editorial Manager, if someone from the original invitations declines, an alternate invitation will be sent so that you can keep sending invitations without having to spend a lot of time in Editorial Manager. Co-reviewing is also a great way to kind of help secure reviewers in which more junior reviewers can gain experience under the mentorship of an experienced reviewer. So you might reach out to a more senior researcher with encouragement that they collaborate to co-review. And for specific article types such as clinical trials or for clinical trial related studies or other studies where it might be appropriate, we can help with securing statistical reviewers. So these are automatically invited for all clinical trial manuscripts, and these are from an internal pool of reviewers that PLOS works with. They will only focus on the statistics of the paper though, so if you have a manuscript with an agreed statistical reviewer, it's still really important to secure a reviewer with relevant expertise. There are some additional steps in here about how to invite reviewers and some FAQs for using Editorial Manager as well. So please do check out that guide. Once you've secured reviewers and you receive the review reports, the next step is then, of course, assessing the reviews and making your editorial decision. The reviews will come in a structured form, but there may be discrepancies in reviewer feedback, and reviewers may not always agree on their recommendation, or you may find a recommendation doesn't fully align with the reviewer's comments. For example, you may see an accept decision that includes revision requests, or you may see a reject decision that's not supported against publication criteria by the reviewer's comments, so a revised decision might be more suitable. There are 4 available decisions, and we have guidance that I'll show you next regarding kind of when to choose each one and what happens next with each one. Regardless of the decision you are issuing, please do add comments to the decision letter with clear context referring to the reviewer's comments and your reasoning behind your decision. This is particularly important for reject decisions because if the authors appeal the decision, they need to fully understand why that decision was made. And if there's not specific context given in the decision letter, those appeals are often granted and those manuscripts are then reassigned to you as the academic editor that issued the decision. So it's really helpful to have that constructive feedback for authors, regardless of what decision you're making. We have this editor's guide for assessing the reviews and making decisions, which takes you through the different steps around assessing and adjudicating reviewer feedback. You may receive opposing recommendations from reviewers, whether that's a reject decision from one reviewer and revise or accept decisions from another. But ultimately, you have the authority as the academic editor to make the final decision. There are some instances in which staff editors might reach out about a decision, but in most cases, you are making that decision. There is no internal oversight before that is sent to the authors. So please do refer to the guidance and please do reach out to the journal if you need assistance in making a decision as well. As the academic editor, you might need to decide which reviewer comments are necessary and relevant for the authors to address. Please do not ever edit the reviewer comments directly, but you can add comments as the academic editor to the decision letter to help guide the authors in terms of which parts of the review report they need to pay the most attention to if there are any comments that you feel are not relevant. For example, if your reviewer comments on the novelty of a study, this is not in line with PLOS publication criteria, so it's not necessarily something the authors need to address. You could give weight to the reviewer comments based on the individual expertise. So if you've secured 2 or 3 reviewers for a manuscript and you know that one has very specific expertise to the methodology, whereas others have specific expertise to the wider context of the study, you might reflect that in your comments to help guide the authors in how to approach revisions. And if you are unable to make a decision on your own, you might ask the reviewers to expand their comments or seek an additional reviewer. You can contact the reviewers through Editorial Manager using the send emails function as well. When you're making an editorial decision, there are 4 major outcomes. So a major revision is where the manuscript has the potential to be published but might not be accepted if the authors do not address substantive comments and issues, whereas a minor revision is more suitable where a manuscript is suitable for publication, but it needs some final minor adjustments before it can proceed to acceptance. In both instances, authors have 45 days to revise and resubmit. And when the authors resubmit, we generally recommend you try and re-invite the original reviewers if they recommended rejection or revisions so that they can have a look and determine whether their comments have been sufficiently addressed. An accept decision should be issued where a manuscript is appropriate for publication exactly as it is. So PLOS does not allow post-acceptance revisions. And as previously stated, all manuscripts require at least 1 external reviewer before an accept decision can proceed. Reject decisions should be issued where a manuscript does not meet the publication criteria or it requires substantial changes beyond that sort of feasible for a major revision. And if appropriate, you might issue a reject decision but encourage revisions and resubmission after substantial revision later on. If authors are encouraged to resubmit and they choose to do so, this is considered as a new submission, but we might approach you to handle it because you've previously handled the initial version of that manuscript. There's also guidance around handling manuscripts post-revision here, and there's a really great kind of template letter for the decision. So in decision letters, there's this section that asks you to add comments, and there's some guidance around what you might want to consider in your comments. There is a really useful editor's guide that is linked in that resource for adjudicating decisions, um, where you can work through based on the theme of the issue. Um, and it's an interactive tool. So if you're new to kind of editor handling of manuscripts and you want some support or guidance in a more practical, real-time approach, this might be a useful tool to use. You can kind of click through, a revised manuscript's come back, you're not sure whether you want to re-invite reviewers, because you're unsure whether the authors have addressed the reviewers' concerns sufficiently. And then it gives some recommendations and it actually gives you some templated text that might be suitable for your decision letter as well. So please do take a look at that. Another resource that you might want to take a look at is our publication ethics for editorial board members. So PLOS work very closely with our internal publication ethics team. But there are some considerations for research integrity that you might want to be aware of in your role as an editorial board member. In all instances, please do contact the General Office if you have concerns. But as an overview, you might want to keep an eye out for authorship disputes, for citation manipulation, for all revised decisions. There is text in the decision letter that is always added that informs authors that no citations requested are required in the revision, and they should always assess those to see if they're suitable. If there are concerns about dual or redundant publication, duplicate submissions. If you've got concerns about the reviewers or the review handling of a manuscript as well, these can be highlighted to us. So I would really encourage you to take a look at this guide and see if there's anything that arises, because the editorial office and the publication ethics team are always here to help if you have any concerns. With that, Marcus, I think it's time to hand back over to you.
Yep, that's all good. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, I can share mine. Thank you. Okay, this should all hopefully be back visible again. Okay, excellent. So, um, all of the resources that we have gone through today can be found on the relevant resources for editors page. These are separated for each of our journals on this slide. And again, all of these slides will be sent to you following this session, so you can refer to them in your own time if you wanted to. Again, if you have any queries on a specific manuscript, all of the journal offices' general email addresses are listed here. And if you have any experience-related queries, so issues with invitation volume, invitations frequently being out of scope, or resignations, although hopefully this won't be anytime soon, then the edboard support at plos.org email address goes straight to the editorial board services team. Okay, so thank you all for listening to us go through all of that. I appreciate it's quite a lot. We do now have some time available for the Q&A portion of the session for myself and Jenny to answer any questions that weren't necessarily covered in the previous slides. I'll just start very quickly with some of the questions that were submitted before the session during the event registration. The only questions really had prior to the event were relating to kind of inviting reviewers and kind of approaches to that. Specifically, these were questions about the best practices for finding suitable reviewers when potential reviewers have declined, and also how to coordinate reviewer invitations to prevent delays. I think this was more or less covered by Jenny in her slides, but Jenny, I don't know if there's anything specific you wanted to add in response to this, other than just kind of referring to the quick guide and the tips we have in there.
I think the only other thing I'd say is just around kind of how many reviewers you should invite, because I think this can be a challenge. You don't want to invite too many reviewers and end up with 6 reviewers on a paper unnecessarily. Um, in general, we find that you need to send 8 invitations to secure 1 reviewer. So sending out sort of 8 to 10 review invitations at a time, and then once those time out, either setting alternates or sending out some more invitations. Is the approach we recommend. Obviously, you might send out 8 invitations and secure 3 reviewers. You might have to send 20 invitations to secure one, because it really does vary based on the field and researchers' availability. There are particular times of the year where reviewers seem to be more or less available. But yeah, if in doubt, sort of batches of around 8 at a time is what we tend to suggest. But obviously, if you sent 30 invitations and not secured any reviewers, that might be a time to reach out to us or to consider whether there's an alternative approach that might be needed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. Okay, so that was essentially all of the questions that came in prior to the event. So if anyone has any further questions that they would like to ask about anything we've gone over today or anything we might not have covered, please feel free to type them in the Zoom chat, or feel free to raise your hand in Zoom using the button at the bottom of the screen, and we'd be more than happy to answer those questions live as well. And there is also a question in here about indicating unavailability. So I will quickly come out of this 1 second. So in the slides, it will be here. So in this quick guide, under getting started, and again, these slides will all be sent out after the session as well. Under getting started, there is a section under unavailable dates. And so this kind of details how to go through this in Editorial Manager and kind of setting these time periods and just adding a quick reason as to why that is. I hope that helps. But if not, again, any kind of queries you have about navigating Editorial Manager or issues accessing anything like that, that Edboard support email address is the one that we'd recommend getting in touch with us on. Yes, I can see someone has their hand raised. Please feel free. Yes, is it? I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Is it Iona? Iana? If you're ha having any issues with your microphone, please also feel free to type them in the Zoom chat as well, and we can take questions from there too. I can see there is another question in the Zoom chat um, about if you've agreed to an invitation to review and then realize you're not capable to handle it. Do you have a choice to reject for handling it? The process in this case, I believe, would be to get in touch with the journal office. Jenny, I'm not sure if you have any other guidance on that.
Yeah, so um, if from the invitation it looks like you kind of got the expertise to handle it, but upon receiving the full manuscript, you realize that it's maybe not quite within your expertise, there's kind of 2 routes really. You could still handle it and ensure you're securing reviews with that expertise that you feel you're lacking in handling it. So you don't necessarily need to, at that point, decline handling it after you've already accepted it. Obviously, if you receive a manuscript and when it comes to you, it's really borderline for your expertise, and you don't feel that even with really specific reviewers, you'd be the best placed person to make that decision on the outcome of the manuscript. If you reach out to the journal office, we can get it reassigned. But I'd say in general, if you've accepted to handle a manuscript and it feels maybe not quite where you thought it was in your expertise, but you have sufficient understanding to know what expertise it needs in reviewers, if you can handle it, it is great if you're able to, because when we have to get it reassigned, that can lead to quite long delays for the authors. And sometimes, the next academic editor might find they have the same challenge. But of course, if you accept to handle something and you no longer feel able to, whether that's because it's outside your expertise or because something else has arisen, personally or professionally, that means you would not be able to dedicate that time to it, please reach out to us and we can seek reassignment. I'd say the main thing is don't reject those for being out of expertise unless you have other concerns with them that would support rejection in line with our criteria.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jenny. Um, there is a question from Leo in the chat. Is there any possibility for us to invite reviewers outside of the current pool of reviewers using the system that we're using? Jenny, I don't know if you want to take that. I was under the impression that you can register new reviewers. So the ones that are kind of available in the system currently are those that have previously been registered. But if you know people outside of the ones that are currently listed in the system, you can register new people using kind of their name and email address in there as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely right. Just going to Iona's question as well in the chat. So I don't think, to be honest, we see a particular trend either way with rejection before review versus after. There are a portion of manuscripts that PLOS reject before inviting academic editors, and we call these desk rejections. And those are rejections for not meeting our criteria for consideration. So this might be for ethics concerns. These are for other concerns that we check at submission scanning or for really clearly not meeting our publication criteria. So if we can clearly see it's a redundant study or it's resubmission of a study that's been published elsewhere, then that's not going to be kind of sent to you. We see a big mix between academic editors rejecting before review. These tend to be for scientific issues that we don't have the expertise in our editorial team to handle or to assess. Whereas post-review rejections tend to again be related to scientific concerns, but they might be things that are raised by the reviewers that the author, that their editor didn't kind of flag, or they might be that the editor, as editors, you might see some things that you think could lead to rejection, but might be addressable by revisions. And then if the reviewers are supporting that recommendation for rejection, you might choose to reject after review. But we don't tend to see kind of a big sway either way. I hope that answered your question.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, excellent. Sorry, my headset was not working. I was actually wondering what is the average, the proportion of rejections at these steps? So kind of how many would get rejected? And then my other question was, I was a bit confused about the one reviewer because I have, for example, accepted an invitation, got one reviewer's comments, but the prompt says that I need two. So I'm a bit confused about that.
Yeah. So I don't know the average, to be honest, for how many papers, what proportion of papers are being rejected pre-peer review versus post-review. I think if we were to pull that data, one being such a big journal, it would vary extensively based on the sections and the kind of areas of research that we're covering. In medicine and public health, where I tend to see papers, we have higher post-review rejections, I think, but in physical science and engineering, we might see that there's a sway the other way. So I'm sorry that I can't provide more of a specific answer there. For your query around reviewers, we encourage two reviewers on submissions, but we can accept manuscripts that only have had one reviewer. So if you've secured one thorough review and you want to issue a decision there, you can, because we do recognize that it's not always possible to secure two reviewers for a manuscript. If there's a functional issue in editorial manager that's not allowing you to do that, you could reach out to the editorial office and we can check. But there shouldn't be a blocker there if you've got a thorough review and you feel that that is sufficient to support issuing a decision. So please do let us know if there's kind of a technical blocker there. We've got some other hands up as well. So I don't know if you want to ask your
May I
question.
ask a question?
There was a hand raised before you. If
Yeah.
you like
Hi.
to unmute.
Hi, am I
Hi.
the next one?
Yes.
Sorry. Hi, Jenny. Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for your presentation. I wanted to ask the more admin bit, which is, do we hold meetings with, like regular meetings with other editorial members or editorial board members and the editor-in-chief to share practices or best practices when it comes to reviewing? Is that something that the journal organizes?
I mean, I don't believe we have anything formally in place in terms of regular meetings like that. We have recently started to introduce more community focused events. So for different journals in people in different sections. But these often have kind of a specific topic that isn't necessarily strictly relating to kind of handling as an editor. But if there's interest in that from our editors, I'm sure that's something that we can take forward. We can talk to Emily, who is our editor in chief in PLOS One, and I'm sure we can discuss that with our other executive editors for the other journals like climate and water and mental health. Yeah, if there's interest in it, then absolutely I can pass that on. But at the moment,
Or
I don't believe we have anything specific
yeah.
in that sense. We do have uh, regular training sessions, I suppose, for dealing with specific aspects of the handling process. I can follow up on who gets invited to those and kind of the rationale for who's selected for that. But yeah, outside of that, I don't believe there are any specific regular meetings with, say, Emily, our editor in chief of the journal.
And a quick follow-up, because this is probably, I'm not sure if this is administrative or editorial, but we do receive reviews that might be conflicting. For example, you do have two reviewers saying one reject, the other accept. So those are two extremes. Um, so I guess as editorial academic editors, we are to break that tie or sort of make that decision ourselves. We don't necessarily have to raise it, for example, to the EIC to check whether our decision is okay, and we just side with one or somewhere like find a middle ground.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so depending on the comments you're getting from reviewers, if you've got two reviewers, particularly when it's really opposing, one recommends acceptance, one recommends rejection, sometimes it's useful to try and secure a third reviewer to help with that kind of
Sure.
time break.
Yeah.
Particularly if the clients on either side are really opposing and there isn't kind of constructive comments within that that might allow you to issue a revised decision and then re-invite the reviewers later on to see if those
Yeah.
comments have been addressed. But yeah, as the AE, you're kind of the adjudicator there, so you can make that decision. The main thing that we'd ask is, particularly if there's a reject decision and you're recommending acceptance, if you can specify in your decision letter, it only needs to be a sentence or two, why you do not feel those comments are kind of supportive or need to be addressed. That's really helpful because the decision letter is sent to the reviewers as well. So it
Yeah.
helps reviewers to understand that you have seen their comments, and to help understand your decision. And it also confirms to the authors that they're not expected to try and address those comments if you're issuing an accept decision. Um,
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, hi. I have a same comment on the same. I'm so here so I have a same comment on this thing. So basically, depends upon your expertise. So, like for example, I have reviewed multiple papers, and most of the papers I rejected because it depends upon my particular expertise in the field. If you have a well-known expertise in your field, then you should have a pretty good chances whether you are accepting them or rejecting them. That depends upon your expertise in the field. That should be one of the main criteria when the academic editors or editorial board member received any papers. So it should fulfill your expertise, and based on your expertise you can make a decision. If you are not sure, then you can invite outside reviewer, but if you are well expertise in the field, yes, you can make a decision.
Thank you. Saida, I'm aware you've been waiting to ask a question for a while as well. Would you like to unmute?
Thank you for the chance and for the webinar you have arranged. It's very helpful for us. My question is, after initial revision, sometimes author resubmit their manuscript and then we again send them to the original reviewer. But sometimes one of the reviewer reject. At that time, what is the appropriate action to do?
So Unfortunately, this really varies case by case. I'd say that if you have two reviewers at first decision and you're able to secure a re-review by one of them, proceeding with the decision after that is fine. If there are really extensive revisions requested and that reviewer is unable to re-review, you can then either decide whether to undertake that assessment yourself, in determining whether the authors have fully addressed all of the comments. And if you feel they haven't, you could issue perhaps a minor revision, or you might invite a new reviewer at that later stage of review. Obviously, it's not ideal to keep inviting additional reviewers. It's a lot of work for you to secure reviewers anyway, and it's potentially then going to introduce conflicting reviews for the authors. So it really does vary on what the initial decision was, how the authors have addressed it. All of the authors are expected to provide a response to reviewer's file alongside their revised manuscript. So generally, by working through that, you can see what the reviewer comment was, how the authors have addressed it, and they tend to either copy in or signpost where those revisions have been made. And I'd say that if you receive a revised manuscript, you're unable to secure a re-review by either of the reviewers, but you've undertaken that assessment and you feel it's suitable for acceptance, or you feel that perhaps minor revisions are still needed, you can issue that decision without further review, if you feel like you would like to. So really, it really varies on the manuscript, and how you want
I
to
was
approach
reading
it.
with this in the last paper, that's why I asked that. Another
Yeah.
question is sometimes we get some old paper that another editor have dealt with that, and later
Mm.
on it comes to me, but the paper is outdated, so old data. At that time, it's difficult to make decision because previous editor doesn't did anything, but the role is that now I reject it. It's embarrassing also. This is I think it's really difficult for me. I also face this situation. That's why I am asking that what is the actual role here?
So, yeah, so sometimes a manuscript might be assigned to an academic editor at a later stage of review, and this can happen for a number of reasons. So often the information for editors and those additional comments from the editorial office can help provide that context. It might be that a revision is submitted and the original academic editor is not available to handle it. Obviously, it's why we ask that when you accept a handler manuscript, you're accepting to handle it through all phases of revision, because it helps us to avoid this situation where things get reassigned. There are instances, however, where a manuscript might be reassigned because of misconduct concerns, or concerns with the previous handling of the manuscript, or because we've identified that there's an undeclared conflict of interest, so that editor should not be handling that manuscript. There's generally a note added if this is assigned at a later stage that helps give you that context and allow you, kind of give you some guidance on how to handle it. And particularly if it's a manuscript that's been through a lot of rounds of revision, it can be really challenging because, as you say, it can feel a little bit like the manuscript's outdated. But if it's been through a lot of revisions, it feels very harsh to reject at that later stage. So I think considering the peer review history of the manuscript, considering the previous rounds of revision and the work the authors have put in, if it was submitted in its current form now, what would you think is best to do with it? And if you feel like a rejection is required, making sure that aligns with our publication criteria. Because if a manuscript's been in review for, say, 6 months, it might not be as current as if it was submitted now, but it doesn't mean there's not value in publishing it. But you might decide to issue, say, a minor revision and have the authors clarify some of the limitations that have arisen in that period where it's been under review. It really, as with all manuscripts, everything kind of varies case by case. We try to avoid reassignments where possible, and there are instances where the staff editor team will handle manuscripts that have been reassigned several times, because we know it presents challenges to academic editors in knowing how best to handle it when you're trying to understand the history of the manuscript before it reached you. But if you receive a reassignment and you don't feel like you're able to handle it, as we said earlier, you can reach out to us and we can we can find kind of another editor to handle it, whether that's another academic editor or whether as staff editors, that's one that we take on. That is a possibility as well. So please do feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you.
I'm noticing that we are a few minutes past the hour. So if we just can take the last question from Jinwon, who has the hand raised.
Yes. Thank you very much to give my question. Yeah, my question is I'm gonna make my first accept decisions for one of the paper I'm handling, and my question is I gonna submit these decisions in the system. This decision will directly go to the author, or it's gonna go to one of the staff editor, and the staff editor gonna proceed the acceptance decision letters to the author.
Jenny, I feel this is probably more within yours. So essentially, if an editor issues an accept decision, in what circumstance would that proceed directly, like straight to the author, or at what point would that be kind of confirmed or assessed by a staff editor prior to that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question because I think there are some misconceptions about what the staff editors do and kind of what oversight there is with your decisions. In, I'd say, 99% of cases, regardless of what decision you're issuing, whether that's a revision, a reject, or an accept, those are sent straight to the authors and the staff editors do not have oversight. As a journal, PLOS One receives around 6,000 submissions a month at the moment. If 3,000 of those are reaching a decision, we do not have the capacity to check all of those, and we're not of the belief that we should need to, because you are academic editors, because you have the expertise to be making these editorial decisions on those manuscripts. So we are entrusting you with that authority. There are a few instances where staff editors might reach out about a manuscript decision, and this isn't specific to accept decisions, this is across all of them. If there is, say, an accept decision and we notice that there isn't an external reviewer in the peer review history of that manuscript, then we would get in touch because that's not aligned with our requirements for accept decisions, for example. There are other instances where, because of the themes of a manuscript, we might have additional monitoring, so we might reach out. But it's quite uncommon for us to kind of reach out about decisions. We're more likely to reach out about a reject decision that doesn't have editor comments so that the authors won't understand the accept decision, for example, the reject decision, for example. For accept decisions, I'd say that we're more likely to reach out if you've received split recommendations from reviewers and it's not clarified in your decision letter why you're issuing an accept decision, and the authors might not understand that they don't need to address reviewer comments if one of the reviews recommends revisions, for example. But there aren't kind of hard and fast rules. It varies greatly based on manuscript themes and the handling of manuscripts. There might also be circumstances where, because of specific authors, we're monitoring manuscripts, and again, we might reach out there, or because of particular themes. For example, we see a lot of clinical risk prediction model papers in the medicine side of PLOS One, and we've recently updated our criteria and our expectations for validation of those models because of the potential clinical implications of that publication. So occasionally, a staff editor might notice that something's not been raised by reviewers that we feel should be addressed, and we might ask you to add a comment or ask your permission to add a comment to a decision letter. But I would say that staff editors will never change your decision without consulting you. Staff editors will never override a decision without consulting you. It's very much a collaborative process when we feel we need to intervene in a decision, because we don't ever want to undermine our academic editors, and we want to ensure that our approach to manuscript aligns with your view as the expert in the field as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen.
You're welcome. Just to quickly add to that, I guess, if you have concerns about a manuscript you're handling, or you would like staff editor input on a decision you're making, you can reach out to us to request that.
Cool, great. Thanks, Danny. Okay, so I will move back to here. So yeah, that essentially concludes. Sorry, apologies. There's some light coming in that I'm trying to avoid so people can see me clearly. Okay, so that concludes the kind of main portion of our meeting. We just want to say again, thank you to everyone for joining today. We are really glad to have you on the editorial board. We're pleased to see everyone really engaged with this. If you do have any further questions or feedback, then please don't hesitate to reach out to us. PLOS and some of the journals themselves are on Blue Sky and also on LinkedIn. So please feel free to engage with us on those platforms. And also just a kind of final note to kind of add here about this. Obviously, as a member of the editorial board, you are also an ambassador for PLOS. You know, you shape the scientific content that we publish and that is, you know, freely accessible to anyone online. If you are in a position to do so, please help us by promoting and advocating for the journal where you can. If you are at a conference and you see a study that would be a good fit for one of our journals, you can recommend that the researchers submit to the journal. They can add in their submission that you recommended them, or just more widely discussing, you know, why publishing in and engaging with open access journals is important to you. All of the above is incredibly helpful for us and the kind of wider community as well. Okay, so this is now the kind of social portion of the event. I will mention that this is completely optional. If you have other engagements or otherwise can't or don't want to participate in this, that is absolutely not a problem, and you are more than welcome to go as well. For those of you that would like to stay for this, we will now separate you out randomly into breakout rooms. There are some prompts on the screen that you can start off with, but of course, please feel free to talk about anything. And you are also free to leave whenever you would like. We will leave the meeting open until everyone logs off. So I will stop sharing and I will stop the